event, the Draper Center for Community Partnerships, and the Asian American Resource Center. Pomona Student Union, the Pomona Student Union is a nonpartisan student-run organization committed to increasing the level of both honest and open dialogue on campus and in the broader community. We challenge assumptions and present a range of perspectives through speeches, discussions, and debates on important issues. Tonight's event will be divided into 3 parts. For the first 45 minutes or so, I will be moderating a Q&A panel with 3 speakers on my left, Professor Valerie Thomas, Maureen Wood from House of Ruth, and Anna Ward from Asylum and Access. For the following 20 minutes, students will get the chance to ask their own questions of the panelists. We will then have a 50-minute student discussion led by our 5 facilitators. Please join me in welcoming our panelists and discussion leaders. The Draper Center states that over 400 students at Pomona College participate in some form of community engagement every semester, and they believe this to be a conservative estimate. While many students who travel outside of the Claremont bubble to do this type of work are comfortable identifying themselves as activists, others believe that activism is a term loaded with political baggage and exclusionary connotations. Moreover, many students who do work that they believe is activist are focusing their efforts in ways that we might not typically associate with the word. To begin, we're going to ask each of our panelists to spend 5 or so minutes telling us about the type of work that they do and how they define the word activism. And please start.
Great. So, thank you, Grant. Again, I'm Anna Worth. I am the Global Policy Officer at an international organization called Asylum Access. And I'll tell you guys a little bit more about what we do in a moment. But I'll begin by saying that, yes, I am an activist. My particular area of focus in my activism is refugee issues, and that means promoting refugees' right to live, in simple terms, a decent life in their asylum country. And my involvement in this area of work has taken a number of different forms over the years. I will say that I think that my understanding of what it means to be a refugee advocate and to be a refugee activist has most definitely changed and evolved over the years. I'm a lawyer by background, so I initially got my start working in this area by providing pro bono legal services to refugees in New Zealand and then for a short period of time in the United States. And right out of the gate, I was extremely excited by this work. I was interested, I was inspired by my clients, and I desired to learn more. So I began sort of asking questions and digging deeper and saying, okay, well, what does refugee response look like in other countries? And when I did that, I learned a few startling things. I actually learned that only a very, very, very tiny percentage of refugees actually will ever make their way or end up in the United States or in New Zealand and the countries that I was working. And in fact, of the world's 16 million refugees, that less than 1% of them will ever make their way to the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand combined. So what this means is that 99% of that 16 million are really in the global south. And that was kind of an aha moment for me. Also learning that half of that 16 million are sitting in refugee camps currently. And these camps are oftentimes, they are enclosed with barbed wires. The camps are strategically placed along borders so that the refugees within are not permitted to exit the camps. They're not permitted to be part of their local communities, excluded from urban areas, excluded from accessing health services and education services beyond the camp, not permitted to work. Even more startling, I learned that the average time that these individuals will live in these asylum countries is 20 years. So I realize we have some kind of a younger-ish crowd here, so you think about that. I mean, for many of you, that would be like spending your entire life sitting in a refugee camp, treated essentially as a subhuman. I found this incredibly disturbing. And it was at that point that I decided to shift my focus from being an individual advocate or advocating for individual justice and working towards social justice, to be an agent of social change, which is what activism means to me, and thinking about how I can use my expertise, my legal expertise, to change laws, policies, and practices around the world so that essentially these people can live a very decent, dignified life in their asylum country. And that's when I joined Asylum Access. We have offices in Tanzania, Thailand, Ecuador, Malaysia. I work in our headquarter office in Oakland, just outside San Francisco. In our countries of operation, we provide free, direct legal services. So assisting refugees who have managed to get outside of camps, assisting them to obtain work permits if they are able, assisting them in their resettlement applications to go on to a third country, and assisting them to obtain refugee status. Additionally, we have locals on the ground who are doing policy advocacy work, so lobbying their governments to change laws, constitutions, regulations, to expand rights for these individuals. At the headquarter level where I work and what I do specifically, in the policy world, I support our advocates on the ground in their advocacy. But I do a lot of lobbying with these major global institutions that have a great deal of power, like the UN Refugee Agency, to try to shape the way that they respond to refugees. Traditionally, they respond very much to providing humanitarian aid and setting up camps and blankets, and we don't see that as necessarily a helpful and useful approach. So I work with them and advocate with them to join forces with us, to advocate and push for more, for rights in exile. I will say this is it's exciting work, it's challenging work, but it's also exhilarating, and I love it, and I'm happy to tell you more as we go forward.
Marina?
Hi, everybody. I'm Marina. I'm the prevention coordinator at House of Ruth. So House of Ruth, we're your local domestic violence agency. We have a lot of different services. Usually people know that we have our emergency and transitional shelters for victims of domestic violence and their children. In the emergency program, they can stay up to 45 days. In transitional, they can stay up to 2 years. We also have a 24-hour hotline, support groups, counseling classes, and a lot of intervention. My job is special, and I love my job because I get to do the one part that I feel like is the social justice part, the education and awareness. I'm the prevention coordinator, so I get to do the part where we hopefully stop the violence before it even starts. And I became interested in that when I was an undergrad at Cal State Long Beach in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And just doing women's studies, I was really found myself drawn to women and violence and how women were subjected to violence every day in different ways. And I felt really personally connected to thinking about women and violence as a survivor of different types of violence in my life and my family as well. And so I thought, how can I stop it? Because I didn't feel like doing something like counseling or intervention things was going to stop violence. I thought, how can I really get to the root of it? And I thought prevention is really where I belong. And I started doing, I did start volunteering at a rape crisis center in my neighborhood in Long Beach. And I learned so many important things during that 40-hour training. I highly encourage anybody who hasn't done a 40-hour training at a sexual assault agency or domestic violence agency to do so. I was really lucky. We had Tiambe Preston at the time was running it, and we got to learn about oppressions and all these amazing things, and I was like, yes. And I just made my own workshop out of it, and we started a campus feminist organization. I did a lot of campus activism and protesting and organizing, and just really felt like I just want everyone to just know what I know now that I wish I knew before I was victimized or whatever. And I just thought if everyone just knew about basic things like you can set boundaries and not you shouldn't be afraid to set boundaries and things like that, and understand, risk reduction tactics, yes, is important, red flags, warning signs, etc. But I was like, that's not really so important as important as teaching people to stop hurting each other. So so I was like, this is what I want to do. So I began doing prevention education at SACA, which is a sexual assault agency. And unfortunately, it was 2009, which is when everything went to shit, basically, and it completely closed, even though it's been open for over 30 years. And I was like, now what? So I went to CGU, I did cultural studies, and I found myself in between, kind of when I was in college, I was doing a lot of activism and organizing with an organization called MIA, Mujeres Iniciando en las Americas. And I went to Guatemala multiple times for probably at this point a total of 6 months doing prevention education over there, because there's a lot of femicide, there still is, in Central America. But I really just found myself on the ground and wanting to work with youth and talking to people about domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking and things like that, along with other things, self-esteem, whatever. So I did that, between undergrad and grad school, and then after grad school I did it again, coming with kind of media studies lens and feminist lens, because in CGU I did cultural studies and media studies. So we made videos and we had a really good time. And then I applied to House of Ruth, and there was a prevention education job, which is really rare in this neighborhood, or probably in any neighborhood, because money, just like with healthcare, the money goes to intervention and not to prevention, so it was a huge deal. And I got it, and they really liked on my resume that I had worked in Guatemala and had made videos with youth, and so they were like, apply for a grant for that. So I did, and I basically was able to kind of continue what I was doing and passionate about in this job. There's a big creative component to it that I can kind of do whatever I want as long as I'm going along with the mission, which is to end domestic violence. So basically just trying to end the power struggles. So anyways, a lot of the stuff that I've done, I guess in the past, I've done, and I just remember when the Afghanistan war started, I went to my first protest in San Francisco, because LA didn't even have something, but I've been doing a lot of protests and a lot of different things, and campus activism. I was doing a lot of protests and film screenings and stuff like that, sending weekly newsletters. I was one of those out of control campus people that was always blowing up your inbox. But for me, I was I just was so excited, and I just wanted to do it. And so I think one thing that I found when I started doing it as a job and getting paid was that now I was really limited in a lot of ways. Maybe I'll get into that later. But I found that, yes, I get to work with video and media and all this stuff, but I'm within certain structures. There's grant requirements involved. There's certain, if I'm working with the school, there's things that schools don't want to see, which is definitely, they don't want you to talk about sex or pregnancy or anything like that. And I found myself confined by being a representative of House of Ruth, or the main representative of House of Ruth, that I couldn't do certain things or felt weird doing things that I was used to doing, like a lot of immigrant rights activism. There's always some weird messaging that we have to worry about, that I've had a lot of struggles within my organization, just trying to talk about that, immigration in particular. So anyways, let me transfer over to what do I think activism is. So I feel like activism is a daily act. It's about the decisions that we make. It's about personal integrity. So basically, if I find what my values are, then I'm just trying to live those values. And I think the activism includes using the different tools and tactics based on kind of the context of which you are and the structures in which you find yourself. So maybe in a college environment where you have the sky's the limit, you could say whatever, and I did say whatever, and I have a lot of enemies at Cal State Long Beach. At this point, some of them retired, thank God, because one day I might want to work there. But, just being able to say whatever you want, and it's fine. But once you're working within other certain structures, there's different limits. And so I'm just trying to push those limits. So when I came into House of Ruth, one of the first things I did was add an immigration component and an LGBTQ component to our 40-hour training. And that was what was important to me, and I'm always just a little bit trying to push, and they see me, even today I was called a rogue warrior, I don't know. I don't feel like I'm that radical. I'm in a feminist organization, but, where you are, you're going to find that there's people that think you're, out of control. So I feel like I always just try to bring it back, especially when I'm doing education, I'm working with teens a lot, so you can imagine the kind of crazy stuff I hear. But I'm just always trying to bring it back to the basics of, is there equality? Are we seeing the value in humans? And are there basic human rights? So when someone tells me something but aren't gay people sinning? And I say, should they be hit? And they're like, well, no. Okay, then let's just leave it at that. So just trying to keep it basic. So also just trying to see, when I'm trying to look at humans, even if I'm looking at someone above me who I feel like is maybe being oppressive, just remembering that's just it's a not real hierarchy. Hierarchies aren't real. And just seeing people for who they are and trying to work past that. Which is pretty great.
Professor Thomas.
Okay, hi. I'm Valerie Thomas. Thanks for organizing this too. I want to say, I know I thanked you sort of personally, but I want to say openly to everybody. Thank you guys for organizing this, and thank you guys for showing up, and also for my colleagues here coming down. I really am happy to be seeing this kind of event happening at Pomona and at these colleges. So I'm very happy to be here. So for me, I have been teaching here since 1998 in Africana Studies and English. And so much of what I do is courses that focus on African diaspora stuff. That's sort of like my area that I was trained in. But anymore, and I've actually been teaching for like 20 years, because I started teaching when I was in graduate school. And so when people ask me what I do at this point, I just say that I teach social justice, though, because that's really what I think that, you were just saying, I think that that's what literature and the arts are. There's always that component there in one way or another, even if it's not like a self-consciously political piece, it is always connected to some kind of political context or something, or some kind of historical context that involves like the political and the social. And so all my courses, I just approach them in that way. I mean, I try to be transparent about the fact that I have an agenda. And my agenda is social justice every time. So I have a course right now that coincides with what we're talking about. It's called Healing Narratives. And that is one of those kind of courses where the whole point is let's use the literature and the art and whatever means we can. It's very interdisciplinary to get at thinking about the politics of health and wellness and healing, and also dis-ease, the ways in which this is figured. And another course that I do that is sort of very particularly social justice oriented, we were just chatting about a minute ago, is literature of incarceration. And that's a course that I knew nothing about when I also knew nothing about healing narratives when I started really like thinking about it. I definitely knew nothing about literature of incarceration when I started the course here. And the reason I started that course was because my first 5 minutes on campus, I just fell into this conference over at Scripps that Sue Castanetto, who's in IWS, Intercollegiate Women's Studies, put together on the prison industrial complex. And I was so blown away like by that conference. I left there with a mission. And my mission was like, how can I have a course that like lets us have this conversation and lets us continue the conversation there. And I want it connected to the English department. I want it connected to the literary, and I want it connected to empowering students to be able to bring all of that expertise to the service of some kind of social justice analysis and work. And so that's my agenda, is empowering students in education and also creating a certain kind of like sense of confidence and interest, and supporting students' interest in doing activist kinds of work and activities, and feeling like that can make a difference. Just because I sort of believe very strongly that everybody needs empowering, even if well, this is sort of another part of the conversation that we're going to be getting to, but I think that even privileged people, or those of us who think that we're sort of like in some way sort of maybe not the oppressed, the most oppressed level, but I think everybody, I think as people growing up in the society and having to make our way in the society, we need empowering all the time, and we need to be able to empower each other. So, let's see. Another of the courses that I do is maybe not so obviously, it's African Introduction to African American Literature, which might sound more like the conventional kind of English course, except that my agenda there is anti-racism. And that's my agenda all the time as well. That's part of it. So I have like a pretty sort of like, all these pieces fit together in one way or another. But the thing about that is, let's develop a critique of racism. Let's develop some skills that allow us to sort of like read when anti-blackness is going on, and read when we're being affected by these kind of like ideas of racial hierarchy and constructions of race, the ways in which they hold us back, the ways in which they silence us, the ways in which they sort of can be a subtext in a situation. And so again, it's about like we do the literary analysis, but what my desire is for that to be something that applies to the real world, and to also be able to kind of pick up those materials that, that exists in kind of a privileged atmosphere where maybe everybody doesn't have access to them, and then you, my students, or anybody that we're having a conversation with and having a discussion with, can be the person who takes that out into the world. And, for other people who maybe don't have access to like being in this particular place or that particular library or, whatever sort of like rarefied atmosphere that we find ourselves in. So there's also that aspect of it too, is that I'm hoping that people who get interested in these courses or take the courses and things are going to carry it away with them and do their own, apply it to their own uses with people. And on the ground, I think being in education has kind of led me to be able to participate in activist kinds of communities and activist kind of activities. And so probably the most direct thing I think that I do other than teaching is to work with in different capacities, but sometimes through the Draper Center, sometimes through intercollegiate women's studies with the women's prison in Chino. And so that has been a place where I take students and in the context of that literature of incarceration course, and we interact with groups of women in the prison who are interested in meeting with students, talking with students, doing writing. We often do workshops, writing workshops and discussion groups there, and work on things like writing your way into sort of a sense of voice and a sense of self. And again, it's about empowerment. But that's ongoing. That's kind of something that I would not have thought ever in graduate school that that's what I would do. In fact, I used to have one of my best friends when I was in graduate school who did that kind of work, and he would always be telling me, "You have to go over to San Quentin," and I'd be like, but it stuck with me because I really respected this person, and I knew eventually that I would get up the courage to. I always felt like if they let me in, they would never let me out. So I had to get over that fear, and that's about it for me. To that question.
Okay, so for our next 3 questions, not all of you are required to respond, but if you choose to, try to keep your answer down to about 3 minutes. All right, so activism sometimes involves entering into a community that is by some measure different from one's own. What are the dynamics at play when this happens? How might issues of privilege inform the expression of activism? If you'd like to start.
So I love this question. It's provocative, it's great. A few things come to mind. The first point that I want to make, when I say that my organization does policy advocacy work in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, I want to just be really clear and reinforce the point that it is locals on the ground who are lobbying their own governments for legal reform. And that's a really important point. So it's not the case that we just have advocates in the global north who are saying to countries in the global south, okay, well, this is what we think you should be doing. It's not that sort of haves versus the have-nots. And I think that that's an important point. I think that that is what is unique about our organization, and I think that that's why we're effective. So just to be clear, it's not that that I'm going up to a Thai official and saying, I really think that this is what your legislation should look like. No, I don't do that. We have an incredibly talented and seasoned Thai lawyer who does that work. Occasionally, I will support her with that. We will talk about things. We will brainstorm together. But that is her role. I do work with the State Department. I do work with the UN agencies. But it's just a little bit different approach there. The second point I want to make is another really important point. At our organization, we have this saying that our clients are people with rights, not people with just needs. And so what that means to us is that we don't view our work, we don't view asylum work or this policy work as charity work. We don't see ourselves as people who are just coming in and people and, oh, look at how, what an unfortunate position, and oh, I kind of feel a little bit guilty, so that's kind of why I do this work. That's not the way that we approach this at all. We perceive our clients as people who are just the same as us. We are talking about human rights. We are talking about rights that are universal, that you are entitled to simply by virtue of the fact that you are human. That we are the one and the same in that. That it's not about differences, it is about our similarities. And that is the equalizing factor. That is what puts us on an equal playing field. And I think that is a really, really important point. So, because I think when you're serving needs, it's a charity, but when you're serving rights, it's more about justice. And so I think that's a really important aspect of our work and how we view it and how that puts us, again, on the same sort of eye-to-eye level with the clients we've been working. I do acknowledge, however, that we've had different privileges along the way. But again, when we're talking about rights, we're talking about one and the same.
Okay. Let's see. How might issues of privilege inform expressions of action? Okay. So I think, privilege. I also just think being self-centered, I guess is the way you could say it. Kind of like to think of being Eurocentric or American-centric or whatever. I think we're also self-centered in many ways of where we're coming from to do our work. We're coming obviously from our own experiences, and so we have our own ideas, biases, experiences that inform how we're going to meet a client or meet a certain maybe problem or conflict that we're trying to resolve. So I think a big part, this is what I try to express in the 40-hour training, is just really trying to push for that kind of self-awareness and self-reflection, and thinking about our own lives, experiences, biases, and where we've come from, and then remember that whoever we're going to be working with is not coming from that same place. So one of the first things I do in the 40-hour training when I'm doing this is first we talk about oppression, then we talk about privilege, and just try to understand where are we coming from and what do we have and how might that differ from somebody else. We don't have to do like a 101. I hate those diversity trainings where let's learn about Asian people. It's not like that. It's just think about you and know that you are coming from this place, so you probably don't understand somebody who's coming from a place where maybe when you say, why don't you just go down the street to the WIC office, and they say, well, I don't have a driver's license. Well, why don't you get one? Well, I'm not documented, or whatever. And they have these other barriers or things that are going on, or layers in their life that this person has never had to think about. And so really thinking about those layers in your own life. So for me, I've had to think about that a lot. I identify as both Chicana and white, but I definitely identify as having white privilege. I benefit from it, I know that. And when I go into, sometimes I have to cover for the Spanish hotline. I do 2 weeks every 4 weeks, and I do different Spanish TV 101 or Seeking Safety or different classes where it's monolingual Spanish speakers. And I know when I walk into the room that I'm going to look different and that my Spanish is going to sound a little bit different, and just trying to remember how they perceive me. And usually they're just in there just thinking, I want to get safe. They're not thinking about me and my identity. But I'm thinking about my identity, and I'm just trying to keep in mind where I'm coming from and remember where they may or may not be coming from, just based on people I've known and letting them just be the experts of their own lives. Also having cisgender privilege. And similarly with my white privilege, I know I benefit from in many ways, sometimes at work, from having heterosexual privilege. Even though I identify as queer pansexual, I currently have a male partner. So if I bring him to an event, I know that I'm not going to have to worry. But at the same time, I've had to out myself to certain people at work, and so then feeling in some ways uncomfortable or not sure if people are comfortable and making certain people uncomfortable, but then at the same time them putting me in certain boxes and just having it be kind of complicated. Or even with clients that are very heterocentric or heteronormative, saying certain things in classes and have to intervene, or even in the 40-hour training having to intervene and making sure not outing myself in any way, then a lot of times people are just pushing and asking me but what is your partner? Because I use the word partner, so it drives people crazy, which is kind of fun, but at the same time is, I think, making people they're not sure if they should accept me or not, and it's strange. But in some ways, for the people who have seen my partner, then I totally benefit, and they think, oh, okay, she's cool, she's just like me. And even, again, not identifying as Christian, growing up in America, I'm very familiar with Christian values and things like that, so I also think I benefit in many ways from Christian privilege, even though I don't, I'm not Christian. I don't go to church or anything like that. But there's certain things that if somebody was to bring up a certain ritual or whatever, I totally know what they're talking about. And I know that in a lot of populations at House of Ruth, there's people that really just don't know that, and so they're not really privy. And so just trying to keep that in mind. And then obviously being American born, that just comes with so much. And at House of Ruth, there's a lot of money-related reasons why not being American-born can be a barrier. And so when you're referring them to resources, there's places that you have to be a citizen in order to benefit. Even at House of Ruth, you get a lot of CalWorks funding, and so you can't get CalWorks if you're undocumented. And so there's a lot of times where some people might be served more, or it might be centered on American-born people. Even though we won't turn someone away, it's not like we're centering on the more oppressed population. And so that's where I feel that it's important to acknowledge your privilege, but also make sure that you're being an ally to the populations that you're a part of. So like, for example, even though I identify as bisexual or pansexual, that doesn't mean that I necessarily understand every other LGBTQ, QIA, or whatever. So just trying to ally myself and make sure that I'm up on the information and also distributing it, because my job is an educator, and just trying to push for rights for everybody. And that's House of Ruth in particular, but also, you know, working with the day laborers and working in Guatemala. I know I look different, and I know I don't necessarily come from where these people come from, where my friends come from, where the community comes from. And so for me, it's all about relationship building and making sure that we're being people-centered or client-centered, thinking about what they need and what they want. So like when I started working with day laborers at Claremont College, is all about like bringing ESL to the corner. So I was like, oh, you guys want to learn ESL? And they were like, no, we want to learn computers. And I was like, okay, let's do that. And so we did that. And that's kind of one way that I feel like if you're just listening to what people need, and you guys can kind of meet and figure out a way. And a lot of times they want resume building, and I've met with them privately, and I have a lot of, just at this point, because it's been like since 2011 that I've been working with day laborers, that I just have friendships. And they'll call me, like recently with the driver's license thing changing, they called me like, what documents do I need? What do I need to ask my family for? And so just making myself available for their needs, and not so much what maybe I think that they need or what anyone else thinks they need.
Professor?
What they said. No, I have, but I have to talk. But I do, seriously, I mean, the difference between making a contribution to an effort on behalf of life or on behalf of a community is a different thing to me than arriving to fix people. That's such a qualitative and important distinction to make, so I'm really appreciating that, you know, that we're addressing that already. I also feel like that question of Christian privilege, I mean, everything that you mentioned, but also on that, I think that is like, that's a whole conversation there. And so the one thing that I'll kind of add on, just you know, as to follow what you're saying, is that I feel like very often, whether we're practicing Christians or not, we are sort of saturated with a kind of like script that makes us walk out into the world as missionaries, and thinking in terms of virtue, and thinking in terms of virtue in some very narrow ways that I think can be problematic when it comes to being accepting and being, you know, maybe non-judgmental. And so I feel like it's necessary to incorporate those kinds of like, as opposed to self-centeredness, which you mentioned, but maybe being willing to sort of enter into doing activist kind of work and social justice kind of work with attention to being open to self-interrogation in that way, and not a violent self-interrogation. I mean, that term is like highly problematic during interrogation, but what I mean is sort of self-examination, self-contemplation, sort of the, you know, taking ownership of just what it is that we're walking with when we walk in the door, and like, what are we bringing into the table? And the other thing is shame. So I don't need somebody personally, if they're trying to assist me, to engage in a ritual of shame about whatever the privileges that they have, you know, boy, that somebody's bringing to the table. I think that people don't necessarily have to be ashamed of privilege if you're using the privilege on behalf of uplifting and making a less violent world and making a more compassionate world. So for me, it's all in like, how do you use the privilege that you have? And the guilt and the shame performance, I think is something else that is sort of spawned by a kind of like Christian, like sort of like momentum that can get behind doing this work that sometimes we're taught and maybe conditioned to think of it as like charity or as philanthropy or something, rather than like, there's other like ways, there's other kind of permutations of doing that kind of work. It can be about becoming a part of a different community and extending community and extending kinship networks and exercising, a kind of participatory democracy, So I just think it's useful to think outside those paradigms. And just as a kind of like, sort of like further note on that, I wonder sometimes if we also don't carry that kind of Christian impetus, the Judeo-Christian impetus, to always expect perfection. And so that's the other thing that I want to say, is that like, I think entering in that, and it's kind of a component of that sort of like, I'm going to fix you. It's also walking in expecting that immediately there is going to be like a solution, or it is going to be fixed, or it is going to be improved or something, which can, it can kind of track our energy in certain ways, that can sometimes be really, in its effect, in its impact can be, I think, violent and also silencing people. And so I'm all for losing the whole Christian assumption that everything has to be perfect or else it doesn't count. And that is also a function to me that has to do with self-acceptance and accepting flaws and accepting mistakes and accepting, contradictions and accepting mystery sometimes, something like not knowing or not being able to like complete it in a completely like 100% perfect way, but doing the best you can. And I think that came up already earlier about, that just people doing the best they can.
All right, our next question. So people who consider themselves activists frequently must be subjects that they find depressing or demoralizing. How can activists balance the need for self-care with the need to remain focused and productive? Professor, would you like to start on this one?
Yeah. So it's kind of like the continuation maybe of what I was talking about just now. And, I do think that look, I think it's a great practice to try and like open up the space between judgments. So I think that especially in academic environments and as any kind of educated people, we master the skill of being judgmental all the time. Like we could judge like everything. We could judge like 15 things at one time. And so I think like it's anathema it's like counterintuitive to us after a certain point, because it's so second nature to always be judging, to suspend judgment, to sort of like leave some time where it's like, yeah, I can observe this and I can like, make some sort of like observations and kind of like gather information without having to assign a label to it and file it, and decide the whole meaning of the thing right away. And so I think it's about like, I think that having practices like that can offset that depressive factor, because it is depressing. It is depressing. I'm depressed. And I'm angry. All the time. Always. Every single day. And I'm also not that nice. I'm working at it. I like working at not, all the time. And that's the other thing, like, if I couldn't be goofy, oh my gosh. Like, like, so I think like also that's, the last thing I'm gonna say is like, you know, that whole like,
I'm here to do like social justice.
I have to have a goofy factor. I have to have the goofiness factor. I gotta be able to laugh. Also gotta be able to dance. Also gotta be able to eat. Also gotta be able to say like, oh, you got out of bed today? Yay! Some days are like that. Some days it matters to be able to do that.
I'll just say, yeah, you nailed it. I love that, you know, you acknowledge it's, sometimes this work can be really depressing. In policy work, it moves at snail's pace. I mean, to change, there's some people nodding here that you know, to change laws and policies, and we're talking like years upon years, a decade, right? And that's really depressing. But you gotta take your little wins when you see them. I mean, I will get like the smallest, you know, a government official who used to, you know, or some State Department who said, "Oh, get out of our office, refugee legal aid," what are you talking about? And now suddenly the door is open and they'll give me 10 minutes of their time. And that is a little win, and I take it where I can. I think for people who are on the ground, for our lawyers, our brave lawyers who are on the ground, who are doing asylum work day in, day out, they are exposed to extremely disturbing information. Being an asylum lawyer in country, first country of refuge, necessarily requires that you have to dig deeply into people's past, understand, you know, their immigration path. And that requires sitting and listening to and remaining professional as somebody discloses information and stories that is, I just got chills, that is beyond things that have happened to them that are beyond our wildest imagination, my wildest imagination. And I think that's incredibly difficult. And I don't want to paint it as anything less. And we do have staff who are burnt out, and they say, I'm overwhelmed, I have to tap out. And that's a reality of this work, and it's hard, there's a lot of turnover. But we do see successes. Ecuador is a country that we work in. A few years ago, they were revising their constitution, and we advocated heavily for the rights of refugees to be included in the new constitution. And we were successful in doing that. The new constitution does expressly provide for the right to work, amongst other rights for refugees. And that means that 250,000 people in that country now have rights that they didn't have before. And that is extremely powerful and exhilarating. So those are the moments that when you get them, you know, that's what powers you forward.
Okay, so I feel like number 3 and 4 are similar, but I might have the same answer for both. So how can we balance need for self-care? And I feel like the biggest thing for me in my job, prevention is difficult because there's one of me in an organization of like 45, and they're all doing kind of similar intervention type stuff. I'm the only one doing this, so it was really hard in the beginning because I had nobody to train me. They just kind of threw me in. Luckily, I had the training from the Rape Crisis Center before, but it was hard because I didn't have anyone to check in with. My supervisor everyone's overworked and everyone's stretched thin and nobody wants to hear about my day. So I was like, okay, how am I going to work on this? And so I had to kind of foster and create a community within House of Ruth with people maybe that didn't have my same job, but where we can kind of share together and create a peer network. And so a big part of staying alive and staying mentally healthy at House of Ruth has been to create that community and to have other people that we can just check in with and vent with. Because some days are really hard. And luckily I don't do intervention on the daily, but even in prevention, there's some really hard days, some of which are like, yeah, intervention-y, where people are disclosing and I might have to go into kind of crisis intervention mode. But a lot of times it's just draining to be talking to a group of whatever, 30, 50, 100 kids, and they don't care, or they're mean, or they're disrespectful, or they're extremely hateful or victim blaming, and sometimes things can be triggering, and it's just like to go home after that and be like how do you kind of take my my heart or my soul that I'm very personally invested in this work, and kind of divide it is really difficult. So it took me a long time to create those personal boundaries of being able to kind of like what some people at House of Roots say is kind of have like that plexiglass screen where somebody's talking at you and it stops here. It doesn't come all the way in and permeate your soul. Honestly, it's really hard. Like some days when I do have to cover and do the intervention and talk to somebody who's in complete crisis, they were just like raped the day before or whatever, or they just left their abusive partner and they're coming into shelter and they almost died, and they might have, you know, petechiae in their eyes, like there are choke marks on their neck, and you're like talking to them, and sometimes I just want to like cry and be like, are you okay? You know, but like you have to kind of just be a little bit like just detached or disconnected, you know, but stay still caring, but not taking it on as my problem. I'm not the one that almost died, and it's not, you know, me, and if I walk away today, this would have been their life either way, or you hang up the phone, because I take hotline once a week. So some hotline shifts are really difficult, where you hang up the phone and you're like, are they going to be okay? Maybe we were full that day and you don't know if they're going to find somewhere to go, or whatever. And so it's really hard to kind of be like not wondering about that. But I just really try to think, luckily I have 40 hours a week. If anyone's ever worked a nonprofit, you know, sometimes if you're salary, you're just expected to work 24/7. Even if you're 40 hours a week, they still kind of expect you to work overtime, and they very much smile upon it but pretend they don't, and it's really complicated and a lot of mixed messages. But I just try to think, well, they told me to work 40 hours, I'm going to work 40 hours, and I do. And if they ask for anything else, I say, oh, so I do overtime? And I make it very clear, like, this is what the limits you said that I have, and this is what I'm going to do, and sometimes people don't like that, and that's why I have maybe some enemies. Not enemies, but people who don't think I'm the best worker, but that's because that's how I'm going to self-sustain. And there's so many people, like she said, that have burnt out. I've seen them go above and beyond, do everything the supervisor wish they did, and they don't survive. You can't survive if you are just putting your whole life into your work. So I have to remember, this is my work, and then this is my social life. And I'll admit, since I started at House of Roots 3 years ago, my activism life off the clock has very much dwindled, because I don't have that much emotional energy to do activism all day, every day, and then afterwards go and do more activism. So it's few and far between that I might find myself driving all the way to Murrieta when everyone was blocking the buses. Yeah, I went, but it was like the one time I did something in the last like 3 months, you know, so it's really hard to do that work-life balance, and I feel like for me the main things are community, so building that community that you can talk to, and then also maintaining those boundaries. And then maybe on number 4, I'll talk a little bit about my self-care tactics.
Okay. Well, getting to number 4. So since we started late and we want to start the discussion as close to 9 as possible, we're going to skip the audience Q&A portion, but we will give the panelists one chance to make a sort of closing statement. So given all the obstacles that stand in the way of productive community engagement, what are some ways that we can make activism more sustainable as a practice? Would you like to start?
Well, I'll just keep going, I guess. Like I was saying, activism is really hard. It's kind of, sometimes activism, sometimes, like I said, nonprofit work can feel abusive. Or like where somebody really, they just want so much out of you, and you feel that guilt, or you feel like if you don't do it, you're not being a good person, or you're not being a good worker, or you're not being a good activist or a real activist. And I've had so many discussions with people where they say, well, a real activist is that, and a real activist is that. And that's why I really try to stick to like my idea of my integrity of what activism is, and I feel like I said it's a daily act. Some people might say if I'm not on the ground doing it, that it's not, or I don't have a picture of myself in a courtroom every day. I'm thinking about my brother. I always have this fight with him because he's also paid in a nonprofit, but his nonprofit is a lot more direct action. So he has all these pictures, and he's always doing these things, and I'm like, yeah, but you're getting paid, and I'm getting paid, and I can't post pictures with clients online because it's illegal and it's confidential, you know, or whatever. And so I don't get all the glory maybe that you get, but it doesn't mean it's not activism or what I think activism is. And so just trying to stay true to that. But for me, it's just maintaining self-care is how you can maintain activism. And so my brand of self-care, I have actually brought you guys presents. I brought you a self-care assessment and self-care plan, which are my favorite things ever, and I do them every couple months. And it's just an assessment of how am I taking care of myself physically, mentally, spiritually, with my relationships, in all these different ways. And then if I'm not really taking care of myself in certain ways, then what can I do to plan to do better? Like maybe I'm gonna like eat more vegetables, or like drink more water, or reach out to those friends I haven't talked to in a while, or, whatever it is. And then even with my, like I said, I made a community at House of Ruth. We actually have self-care girl nights. We're pretty much all women there, by the way. But we made a self-care box, and so we created a self-care plan and wrote them all on different things and affirmations and put them in the box. And whenever I'm feeling low at work or needing extra, energy, I'll open the box and kind of read something. I know it's really touchy-feely, but it's really helpful for me to kind of maintain in that environment, especially. It's a great environment, like I said, I create a little community, but it's actually really, like I said, it can be really draining to be around a lot of people who expect so much from you. So just working on self-care every day and making sure I'm doing something for myself, and also not expecting too much or being too hard on myself. So a lot of times I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing this or that, but I'm like, but I am working on journaling more. So I'll focus on eating more vegetables later, or like I'm exercising this week, so let me focus on this other thing at another time and not expecting too much.
I just wanted to build on that. I mean, when you talk about sustainability of activism as a practice, and you make some really great points, because there's two sort of sides to the coin. One is about sustainability of activism as an individual practice, but then there's also the other side of the coin, which is about sustainability of activism as an institutional practice, right? And how do you ensure that? I think you sort of spoke to the point about self-care and the individual side, but as an institution, I just want to make the point that, what we've learned is that we set very sort of long-term goals, right? And we acknowledge that, like I said, that we're in it for another 5, 6, 10, 15 years. And so our strategy in getting to that end point often requires that we have to pivot as advocates and activists. We start with one technique and we say, okay, we're going to start doing policy advocacy. Great, that's what we do in Thailand. Oh, but by the way, there's now a military coup in Thailand. So all of that work that we had done to reform their Immigration Act, kind of dead in the water. We got to pivot. And so when we do that, we say, okay, what sort of other entry points do we have? We're going to start doing community legal empowerment. We're going to have advocates, refugee advocates, who go out into the communities and say, look, this is how you can know your situation and how you can avoid detention. So that's what type of advocacy and activism we're doing there. We also say, okay, we got to pivot. Now we can no longer do national advocacy. We got to do advocacy with the State Department. We got to go do advocacy with the UN. So I think it's very much so about acknowledging that you have a toolbox, and that at any given point you're going to need to know what type of tool to use at what given point. And sometimes you've got to be ready to pivot and stay sort of nimble, if you will.
I'm going to go back to the point about tapping out. You cannot overemphasize, I think, just how important that is. So I want to just come back to it, highlight it and underline it. That it can be really something that just happens without us even knowing it. That you are, at the point where it's time to fall back a little bit and replenish. And because the work is important, and because you're dedicated, and because you feel it deeply, and we're passionate about it, I think that there are many people who end up doing this, a fair number of people who do this kind of work, at least, who are also empaths, right? Who are very open and very sensitive, are feeling it all the time. And that is also a state in which you could be taking a lot of stuff in. You need to unplug sometimes. We have to unplug and not be on the front lines all the time. And so also there's a kind of I think process that has to happen about feeling building community. One of the benefits of building community is having that ability to say, I think somebody else can come forward now. Or who else, or opening the question to the community, who else can step in right now. So the tapping out thing, I think, is really crucial. The other thing I would say, just for this is just my own little sort of thing that I feel compelled to pass on, and we sort of touched on it a little bit already, is have a practice that lets you commune with your spirit in some way. And I don't care what the practice is, like, I don't care what you sign up for, like, you know, like religion-wise, or if you don't sign up for any religion, or multiple religions, I don't care what that is, like that makes no difference to me. In fact, you don't have to call it a spiritual practice, like I advocate for some kind of spiritual practice, but as a sustaining thing, and as a practice of love, you know, so I think even an atheist can have practices. Like, okay, so I think as an atheist, you could still, you know, you don't have to like find a label for what you're doing, but you can honor life, you know, and there can be practices, there can be sort of intentional practices and very replenishing practices that do that. Even if it's just to get your body in, you know, out in like the nature, right? Like, well, we still have it. You know, to like lay yourself down on the ground, get your heart close to the earth. You know, seriously. I like, you know, Todd is like one of my favorite people in life. I'm so sorry he couldn't be here. But like, you know, Todd, like when he was working on his thesis, he would be like, okay, at the wall here. And I would be, Todd, go out in the yard, go out and there's like a whole like bunch of grass out there and there's a gardener for every blade of grass. You know, so the grass is all like perfect. Go out there and like stick your feet in that fountain and then get on the grass and spin. I want you to just spin. And he would be like, what's wrong with you? You know, of course it's hard to spin. But I'll tell you something, it's like, it's to get back in our bodies. So it could be yoga, it could be dancing, it could be, you know, it could be doing art. I think we haven't talked about art in connection with this, but you know, claim your art, okay? Art is not just only for people who have a degree in art. You know, and you don't have to be like even good at it, right? Like, oh, like, you know, you see, like, you guys are gonna be looking for me now, because I drive up and down the street in my car and I'm like, hello! I'm singing to every song on the radio, you know, and you'll never see me singing probably like, you know, outside of a group in a room or something. Like I have to have a chorus surrounding me, but I mean, you gotta do those things that are like, just let your body have some, you know, healing, some fun. That's, you know, get in the water. A lady a writer came to our class the other day, and she wrote a memoir, and I think it's also good to build a library. I think we need archives. I think we need archetypes. I think in the process of decolonizing, which I think is part of fighting back on the Depression, to really adapt your own like process of decolonizing. We all have a colonial education. Hello, how are you? Thank you very much. We're all colonized. We have been given, you know, we've been like handed education by the colonialists, by the imperialists. So we're all there. So my thought is like, you know, we can start somewhere at any place on the spectrum of decolonizing and figure out like, what does decolonizing mean to you in like your everyday self, you know, your everyday life. And I think that can be a source of great energy to do that. And so if it means like, you know, maybe not always being in standard English, or maybe like not hating the vernacular, or maybe like, you know, going to your ancestors and figuring out, you know, what were your ancestors thinking about? What knowledge do you have in you or access to through them that can help sustain you and you know, us in this? What are the archetypes that are embedded in your own past, you know, that we could bring forward? Because some of this is also about, like, I mean, you know, we're sort of the subtext of this is like, how do we all get ourselves to the future? And so I believe people like Angela Davis and like, you know, and others, June Jordan and Audre Lorde and others, when they say like, you have to go to the past. There is no decolonizing without going to the past. There's knowledge back there. One of the things that colonialism has done for us is convince us that like our ancestors aren't shit. Like, you know, they didn't know nothing, you know, they're primitive, they like didn't have civilization, they didn't have like writing, you know, printing presses and stuff. And so there's nothing there for us. But that's not true. They have plenty, and it just takes, you know, I mean, one of the sort of benefits of the privilege that we have about being connected to like either organizations or institutions is that we have access, because the other thing is that a lot of people don't have access. We have access, you know? And we might not have all the access, but we have some access, and so we can like go digging. We can go digging for stuff. We're at the places where we can go digging for stuff, and it does take digging because the stuff has been distorted and erased and hidden, and what do you call gatekeeping around it? You know, people set up walls around it, and you have to jump through 50 hoops to get in and get to your own, my own knowledge and stuff. But you can do that with the benefits of being allowed to walk around in these spaces, you know, these places of power. And I've been talking for a long time. Can I say like just 10 seconds on this? I see a lot of students who are smiled by power into that position of emptying themselves out for free. And so especially like with students who are activists, students who are like there, you know, who like show up, can be like kind of like in a certain way, I think, like absorbed into the institutions that are practicing institutional violence, but they're smiling, right? So confusing because they're like, you know, oh, you're so great, you know, you're so like wonderful. You need to come to like this panel, and then you need to be on this thing, you need to be in this committee, and yeah, you can do your schoolwork, but you need to show up for like, you know, this event and stuff like that, and all those things. And that's the tap out factor right there, because like, you know, you also have to like understand like how power was working. If they're making you be, as a student, be a consultant and behave as if you're like a paid, trained person whose job it is and who chose and who knows and who has like the ability to establish boundaries, but the power differential is different when you're a student, then please, like, you know, like at least have the ability to say like no to some things if they're going to be the thing that is going to be like that one straw that breaks your back, you know? Like if it is that one thing that you're just like, I'm so dedicated to this, and they're wanting, you know, they're asking. Sometimes it's okay to say no if it's going, you know, and I'm like serious about this because like even for me, I would not have made it through graduate school at all if it wasn't for like professors who were doing their jobs as activists and who had, you know, everybody's back, not just my back, everybody's back. Well, they all died before they were 59. Every single one of them. And that's why I'm talking about like maybe 6 or 7 people. And this was at UC Berkeley, right? A wonderful institution and everything, and known for being like a progressive, like radical institution, all that, but oh no, these people were like on the front lines all the time in their capacity, and they were like pretty much, you know, they either had stress-related diseases, okay? Cancer, diabetes, some of them emotional difficulties that became debilitating and finally fatal and things. And so I also want longevity, okay? You know, the long view. So that's okay.
All right, let's all thank our 2 panelists. Now we're going to spend a couple minutes having a break, and then we're all going to gather on the floor here for our discussion. Our 3 panelists are welcome to stay and listen in if they like. So yeah, we'll